When did turning toward yourself start to feel like a betrayal? When did the simple act of attending to your own inner life, your doubts, your fatigue, your longing for something you cannot quite name, begin to carry the faint smell of selfishness, as though the very impulse to look inward were a small crime committed against everyone who depends on you? And what if the guilt you feel every time you close the door, every time you sit in silence and let the world's demands recede for just a moment, were not evidence of your moral failure at all, but rather the first sign that something essential in you has been waiting, patiently, stubbornly, for a very long time, to finally be heard? Carl Jung spent the better part of his life thinking about what happens to a person who never asks these questions. He called the process of genuine self-encounter individuation, and he was careful never to describe it as a luxury or a retreat from the world. For Jung, individuation was the opposite of withdrawal. It was the slow, demanding, often uncomfortable work of becoming the specific person you actually are, rather than the convenient shape others have needed you to take. He understood it as a moral act, perhaps the most serious moral act available to a human being, because a person who has never genuinely met themselves can only ever give the world a performance of generosity, a facsimile of presence, a costume worn so long it begins to feel like skin. And here is where the idea deepens into something that may unsettle you. Jung did not suggest that individuation was pleasant. He believed it was, in a very real sense, a confrontation. Not a confrontation with other people, but with the parts of yourself you have been carefully, dutifully, sometimes desperately avoiding. The beliefs you inherited and never examined. The needs you dismissed as weakness. The desires you buried because expressing them would have made someone else uncomfortable, and their comfort, somewhere along the way, became more important than your truth. Perhaps what makes this feel so forbidden is precisely that. To turn inward is to risk finding someone there, not the person others have needed you to be, but the older, stranger, more particular self that existed before you learned to be useful. Before you learned that love was something earned through accommodation. Before you discovered, in whatever quiet way children always discover these things, that being fully yourself had a social cost, and that the cost was one you were not sure you could afford. Jung watched this happen in his patients, and in himself, with what you might call compassionate ruthlessness. He noticed that the longer a person postponed this turning inward, the more the unlived life accumulated pressure, not as madness necessarily, but as a pervasive, low-frequency dissatisfaction, a sense that the life being lived was somehow adjacent to the real one, that you were always almost present, almost yourself, but something, duty, habit, the fear of what others would say, kept you one step removed from your own center. The moral weight he placed on individuation was not vanity dressed in philosophical language. It was a recognition that an unexamined self does not disappear. It leaks. It projects. It shapes your relationships in ways you cannot see, precisely because you have never looked directly at it. And so the person who insists there is no time for such self-indulgence, who fills every silence with obligation, who would sooner dissolve into the needs of others than sit quietly with their own, that person does not escape the self. They only lose the ability to take responsibility for it. To turn inward, then, is not the beginning of indifference. It may be the only path to a generosity that is real. And yet, and here is where it begins to cost something, the moment you start to turn inward, the people around you will feel it before you have said a single word. Not because they are perceptive in any deliberate sense, not because they are watching you with unusual care, but because what you were offering them before was not your presence, it was your performance. And performances, when they stop, leave a silence that is difficult to explain and almost impossible to ignore. Carl Jung spent a great deal of his intellectual life thinking about the structure of this performance. He called it the persona, a word borrowed deliberately from the Latin term for the mask worn by actors in ancient theater. The persona is not a lie, exactly. It is something more complicated than that. It is the face you learn to wear in order to belong, assembled carefully across years from the signals others sent you about which parts of yourself were welcome and which were not. The warmth, yes. The helpfulness, absolutely. The anger, perhaps not. The ambition that made others uncomfortable, Better to keep that quiet. The grief that went on too long, the joy that seemed excessive, the opinions that complicated the room, all of it gradually pressed inward, out of sight, replaced by a version of you that ran smoothly, caused no friction, and cost you something you could not yet name. Jung did not condemn the persona. He understood it as necessary. You cannot move through the world without some degree of adaptation. The difficulty is not the mask itself, it is forgetting that you are wearing one. And the forgetting happens slowly, almost tenderly, until the day arrives when someone asks what you actually want, and you find that you genuinely do not know. Not because the answer is hidden, but because the question stopped being asked so long ago that the part of you who might have answered it learned to stay quiet. Imagine a river that once ran along its natural course through a wide valley. Over time, the farmers on either side began to ask small favors. A channel here, a small diversion there, a branch to carry water to a field that would otherwise dry out in summer. And the river, because it was generous by nature, agreed to each small redirection. First one tributary, then another, then a dozen more, each one reasonable in isolation, each one easy to justify. But the original channel, the one that followed the land's own logic, the one that had carved its path over centuries according to its own internal necessity, that channel narrowed, then silted, then went still. The river was everywhere at once and therefore, in the truest sense, nowhere. It had given itself into so many separate obligations that the thing it had been before the diversions, powerful, self-directing, alive with its own current, had simply ceased to exist. And when the dry season finally came, every field it had promised to sustain discovered the same truth at the same moment. There was nothing left to give. Perhaps something in that image is familiar to you, not as a dramatic collapse, but as a quiet, accumulating exhaustion, the sense that you have been present for every person in your life and somehow absent from your own. This is what self-neglect disguised as generosity actually feels like from the inside. It does not announce itself as sacrifice. It arrives wearing the language of responsibility, of love, of being needed. And being needed, at first, felt like belonging. It felt like proof that you mattered, that your presence made a difference, that to be useful was to be safe. Nobody told you there was a cost. Or perhaps they did, and you interpreted their telling as selfishness on their part, because the alternative, that you had built a life around an arrangement that was quietly draining you, was simply too difficult to sit with. So the persona held, the performance continued, and the people around you, the ones who had come to depend on a version of you that asked nothing for itself, they did not need to be calculating to benefit from that arrangement. They simply grew comfortable inside it. They organized their expectations around your availability, your steadiness, your willingness to redirect your own current wherever it was needed. And then you began to turn inward, and the silence, when it came, felt to them like withdrawal. Imagine a river that believed its purpose was the land around it, not the sea it was moving toward, not the source it had come from, but the fields on either side, the dry soil, the livestock, the villages that had built their whole rhythm around its proximity. And so the river did what it had been quietly taught to do. It dug channels into itself, one toward the eastern pasture, one toward the mill, one toward the orchard that hadn't learned to survive on rain. It gave because it could, and for a time the giving felt like meaning. Every green field a confirmation that it was not wasted, not without purpose, not merely passing through, but a river that divides itself entirely, has no current of its own. The channels grew shallow. The water that reached the farthest fields arrived already tired, already thin. The villages kept drawing from it without noticing the level drop, because it had always been there, because they had organized their irrigation schedules around its constancy. And constancy, once established, becomes invisible. Nobody thanks the ground for being solid. Nobody asks the river if it is full. Until one dry season, without drama, without announcement, the main channel ran dry. And the strange thing, the thing worth sitting with, is that the river had not been depleted by drought. There had been rain, there had been snowmelt upstream. The source had not failed. What had failed was the river's willingness to move forward as itself, to let its own current carry it somewhere, before dividing what remained. Perhaps that river is not unfamiliar to you. Because what the world calls generosity is sometimes something quieter and more complicated. A person who learned, very early, that their presence was most welcome when it came without demands. That love arrived most reliably when you were useful. That safety lived on the other side of self-erasure. And so you gave your time, your attention, your steadiness, not always from abundance, but sometimes from a kind of fear so old and so familiar that it long ago stopped feeling like fear at all. It began to feel like virtue. It began to feel like who you were. This is what makes self-neglect so difficult to see from the inside. It does not arrive wearing the face of neglect. It arrives wearing the face of generosity, of loyalty, of duty. It says, I am here for you. It says, your needs can wait. It says, this is what love looks like. And because those words are not wrong, because generosity and loyalty and duty are genuinely good things, the arrangement hides inside them, borrowing their dignity. Jung understood that the persona, the mask shaped for belonging, does not feel like a mask. It feels like a self. It was built from real experiences, real consequences, moments when your authentic response was too much, too inconvenient, too uncomfortable for the room, and you learned to smooth it down. Over years, that smoothing becomes second nature. You stop noticing that you are editing yourself. You only notice a vague tiredness that you attribute to circumstance, to workload, to the demands of the season, anything but the actual source, which is the continuous expenditure of energy required to maintain a version of yourself that was built for other people's comfort. How many times did you leave a conversation feeling hollow and tell yourself it was just a long day? How many times did you agree to something your body had already said no to and override that signal with a story about responsibility? How many times did you sit with someone else's urgency as though it were your own, solving a problem that was never yours to carry, while the thing you actually needed that day went unattended, unnamed, folded quietly away for later, and later never came? This is not a small thing dressed up in philosophical language. This is the primary way that people lose themselves, not in catastrophe, not in a single decisive moment of surrender, but in the daily, unremarkable practice of placing yourself last so consistently that eventually you forget you were ever in the queue at all. Distraction numbs, attention transforms. And the attention you have spent your whole life directing outward toward other people's stability, other people's feelings, other people's version of who you should be, is the same attention that, turned inward, begins to show you what is actually there. There is a face passing through your head right now, isn't there? Someone specific. Someone whose emotional weather you learned to read before they even spoke. Someone for whom you became, over time, a kind of translation service between their inner world and the one they found too difficult to navigate alone. You know the pattern. You have lived it more than once, with different names, different faces, the same invisible contract. If you want to understand why that keeps happening, why the same dynamic finds you in new rooms with new people, there is a video in the pinned comment below that traces the mechanism precisely. Not to condemn the pattern, but to see it clearly enough that it loses some of its hold. Because here is what that pattern rests on, and what makes it so difficult to interrupt. When you begin to turn genuine attention toward yourself, not as a performance of self-care, not as a temporary retreat before you return to your duties, but as a real, sustained act of looking inward, the people around you feel it. They may not name it, they may not understand what has shifted, but something in the relational atmosphere changes, and it changes for them in a way that can feel, from the outside, like a withdrawal of something they had come to depend upon. And so the guilt arrives. Quietly, reliably, dressed in the language of concern. Am I being selfish? Am I abandoning the people who need me? Is this inwardness just another name for indifference? Perhaps it is worth sitting with that question rather than rushing past it. Imagine a lighthouse keeper who had tended his station for so many years that the light itself had become the whole of his identity. He knew the rhythm of the ships. He knew which captains would pass on certain tides, and he had made a silent covenant with each of them. The light would always be burning. And so when the mechanism that fed the flame began to wear down, when the lens clouded and the oil ran low, he did not stop to repair it. He kept the light burning on the strength of his own vigilance, through the nights when he should have slept, through the mornings when he might have restored what was quietly failing. The ships passed safely, the light held, and then one winter, without drama, the flame went out. Not because of the storm everyone had feared, but because there was nothing left to sustain it. The keeper had given every hour to the light, and none to the lamp. He had tended the appearance of the flame without ever attending to the source. The ships that had sailed safely for years found themselves in darkness, not because he had abandoned his post, but because he had confused the post with himself. This is not a story about martyrdom. It is a story about the difference between showing up and wearing yourself down in the name of showing up. The keeper's dedication was genuine. What failed him was the belief that attending to himself was somehow separate from attending to the light, that these were competing loyalties rather than the same act. Jung understood this with particular clarity. Individuation, for him, was never a withdrawal from relationship. It was the necessary precondition for genuine relationship. When you do not know who you are beneath the persona, beneath the mask you built to ensure belonging, you cannot truly meet another person. What you offer them instead is a performance of closeness, responsive, attentive, warm, and hollow at its center, because the self that would make the connection real has been set aside in favor of the self that keeps the peace. Withdrawing your attention from others is not abandonment. It is the first honest thing you may have done in years. That line deserves some space, because the care you offered from a place of self-erasure was not, in the end, the gift it appeared to be. It asked something in return. Even if silently, it asked the other person to remain needy enough to justify your sacrifice. It built connection on the logic of debt. Real care, the kind that leaves both people more themselves afterward, can only come from someone who has first made the return journey inward, who has looked at what is actually there and decided, with some degree of honesty, to stay. Not every absence is a loss. Sometimes it is the only way back to the parts of yourself you abandoned. And here is where something stranger enters the reflection. When you turned your attention outward for long enough, when you made a practice of reading every room, anticipating every need, smoothing every edge before anyone else could feel it, you did not simply exhaust yourself. You did something subtler and more consequential. The parts of yourself you could not afford to look at, the anger you deemed too dangerous, the ambition you called selfish, the grief you buried under other people's crises, those parts did not disappear. Nothing in the psyche simply disappears. Jung understood this with a clarity that can feel almost uncomfortable to sit with. What you refuse to own in yourself, you will eventually see in the world around you. He called it the shadow, not the dramatic darkness of someone broken, but the ordinary human collection of everything you decided was too much, too inconvenient, too unacceptable to carry openly. The shadow does not wait patiently. It finds another address. You begin to notice the selfishness in everyone else, because you have not permitted yourself to want. You resent the people who rest, because you have forgotten how. You judge the ones who ask for too much, not because their asking is truly unreasonable, but because your own asking has been locked in a room you have not opened in years. The projection is not a moral failure. It is a message. Every figure who irritates you without entirely logical cause, every pattern you keep encountering in person after person, every trait that makes something tighten in your chest, these are, at least in part, mirrors. Not perfect ones, not the only truth about those people, but mirrors nonetheless, reflecting something that belongs to you, something waiting to be recognized rather than condemned in another. Imagine a man who inherits a large house with many rooms. For reasons he could not fully articulate, perhaps he was told certain rooms were dangerous. Perhaps he simply learned early that some doors were better left closed. He boards up an entire wing. He does not demolish it. He boards it up. For years he lives in the remaining rooms, making them as comfortable as he can, becoming genuinely expert at the space available to him. But on certain nights, he hears sounds he cannot explain. He begins to tell visitors that the house is haunted. He warns them about the cold that sometimes moves through the hallway. He develops a reputation as someone who lives with strange presences. The haunting, of course, was never supernatural. It was the boarded wing, settling, breathing, asserting that it existed. The day he finally takes the boards down and walks into those rooms, he does not find monsters. He finds old furniture, dusty light, his own handwriting on the wall from some year he barely remembers. The haunting ends not because the rooms change, but because he stops making them forbidden. The parts of yourself you exiled are not monstrous. They are simply unvisited. Distraction numbs. Attention transforms. This is not a call to become absorbed in yourself to the exclusion of everything else. It is something quieter and more precise. It is the invitation to stop treating your inner life as a territory too dangerous to enter, and to begin, slowly, carefully, walking those halls. There is a face passing through your mind right now, isn't there? Someone whose behavior traces the exact pattern this reflection has been describing. The one who asked without offering, or withdrew without warning, or seemed to need your smallness to feel comfortable in their own size. That face will change. The name will be different next time. But the pattern will find you again, because patterns do not follow people. They follow the unresolved questions we carry into every room. There is a separate video that maps the mechanism behind that repetition, why we keep arriving at the same dynamic with different faces, and what it takes to genuinely interrupt it rather than simply survive it. It is pinned in the first comment below, or you will find the card on screen now. It is the natural companion to what we are sitting with here. To return to the reflection. Perhaps what has been most costly about the long habit of self-neglect is not the exhaustion, though the exhaustion is real. It is not even the resentment, though that too accumulates in the body like sediment. What is most costly is the slow narrowing of your own perception. When you do not look inward, you lose access to your own signal. You become less able to tell the difference between what you genuinely feel and what you have decided you are supposed to feel, between a relationship that is actually nourishing and one that has simply become familiar for me. And the people who needed that narrowness from you, the ones whose comfort depended on you not knowing your own signal too clearly, most of them never planned it that way. This is perhaps the most disorienting thing to sit with, because the mind wants a villain, wants a clear source of the harm, and there is a particular relief in finding one. But if you look honestly at the people who shape the habit of smallness in you, what you find, more often than not, is not malice. What you find is their own unresolved fear. The mother who became anxious when you drew boundaries was not trying to diminish you. She was trying to manage her own terror of losing connection, a terror she never learned to name. The friend who drifted when you stopped being endlessly available was not punishing you deliberately. They had simply built their own sense of stability around your constancy. And when that shifted, they felt a ground they had not known they were standing on give way beneath them. The partner who grew distant when you started taking up more room was not meeting your growth with cruelty. They were meeting it with a fear they did not have the language for. This does not mean the impact on you was not real. It was. But understanding replaces the need for condemnation, and that replacement matters, because condemnation keeps you tethered to them. It keeps the story about them. Understanding allows you to take the story back, to look at what happened not as proof that you were wrong to want more, but as evidence of how much the people around you had also learned to live on very little. They were running their own invisible battles. Schopenhauer wrote that every person lives enclosed within the limits of their own consciousness, the way they live within their own skin, directly accessible only from the inside. What looks from outside like indifference or control, or even cruelty, is frequently just a person's private suffering finding the only exit it knows. When you understand that, you can stop waiting for an apology that will never arrive in the form you need, not because you were not owed one, but because the person who owes it has never fully seen what they were doing. And perhaps the most profound thing individuation asks of you, what Jung called the work of becoming genuinely oneself, is not the act of turning inward, but the act of turning inward without turning cold. The invitation is not to harden, it is to see clearly and still remain capable of warmth. Those two things are not opposites. Clarity is not cruelty. Knowing what was done to you does not require you to reduce the person who did it to only that. Imagine a man who spent 30 years tending a garden that belonged to his neighbors. He pruned their trees. He watered their beds. He learned the particular needs of every plant in every corner of their land, and he did it well, and there was genuine love in the doing of it. But his own garden, The narrow strip of earth just on the other side of his wall, he visited only in passing. He told himself there was never quite enough time. He told himself it could wait, and slowly, without his meaning it to, his garden became not a garden, but a memory of one. The soil went unturned. The plants that needed tending grew in the wrong direction, or not at all. And when he finally stepped through his own gate, not from bitterness, not to abandon the neighbors, but simply because he had begun to feel the wrongness of the arrangement, what he found was not ruin. The soil remembered. The roots that had been neglected were still there, still alive, still oriented, impossibly, toward light. What he had to grieve was not the garden. What he had to grieve was the years he had stood at the wall, looking the other way, telling himself that tending others was the same thing as tending himself. It never was, and it never is. That grief is not a detour. It is the beginning of the turn. Because what changes when you finally bring your attention home, truly home, not as a retreat from life, but as a return to its source, is not that the world shrinks. It is that you stop misreading it. The signal you had lost access to begins to return, faint at first, then steadier. You start to notice sooner when something is costing you more than it is giving. You start to catch the moment, before it becomes a pattern, when you are performing rather than present. You start to distinguish between the relationships that have room for all of you and the ones that were only ever designed to hold the smaller version of you that had learned to take up less space. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. Not all distance is the same. Not every withdrawal is abandonment. There is a kind of pulling back that is actually a pulling together, a gathering of yourself from all the places you had scattered your attention, your energy, your willingness to be reshaped by whoever needed you to be different. You were not abandoning anyone when you did that. You were, perhaps for the first time, refusing to abandon yourself. This is where Jung's concept of the shadow becomes something more than a psychological abstraction. Because what you did not attend to in yourself did not disappear. It went underground, and from underground it found its way into how you saw everything else. The irritation you felt toward people who seemed effortlessly at ease, that was not mere envy. It was the part of you that had never been allowed to rest, watching others rest and not knowing what to do with that image. The contempt you sometimes felt for people who needed a great deal of reassurance, perhaps that was the need in yourself that you had taught yourself never to voice. We condemn most loudly in others what we have most thoroughly forbidden in ourselves. Jung understood this with a clarity that still unsettles, because it removes the comfort of a simple narrative. The world stops being divided into the giving and the taking. It becomes something more complicated and more merciful. The most neglected relationship of your life is the one with yourself, not because you are the most important person in any room, but because every other relationship passes through you. The quality of your presence with another person is only ever as deep as the quality of your presence with yourself. When that inner ground is untended, you bring your unexamined fears into your closest bonds and mistake them for observations about the other person. You bring your unnamed grief into conversations and hear it as accusation. You bring your hunger for recognition and call it concern. Imagine a lighthouse keeper who lived for years in devoted service to every ship that passed his stretch of coast. He knew the rocks, he knew the currents. He kept the lamp burning through storms that would have driven another man inside, and he was proud of that, proud of the constancy, proud of the light he gave to others crossing darkness. But slowly, so slowly he did not notice it as a single change, he began to neglect the room beneath the lamp. The walls grew cold, the small fire he had once kept for himself went unlit. He told himself it was a small sacrifice. He told himself the ships needed the light more than he needed the warmth, and for a while, that was enough. The purpose of the lamp was enough to sustain him. But purpose without self-replenishment is a candle burning from both ends. One winter, without drama, without announcement, the lamp began to dim. Not because the oil had run out, but because the keeper's hands had grown too cold and too tired to trim the wick with the steadiness the work required. The light he had given so freely to others was failing not from lack of dedication, but from lack of tending to the one who held it. The ships he had guided for so long could not have told you what he looked like. Some of them never knew there was a keeper at all. They only knew there had been a light. You have been that keeper. Perhaps you still are. And the question the image leaves with you is not whether the ships deserve the light, They did. The question is whether you ever gave yourself permission to tend the room below. Because here is what the parable makes visible. The light and the keeper are not separate concerns. They are the same concern. Your capacity to be genuinely present with another person, not performing presence, not manufacturing warmth from a place of depletion, but actually arriving in a conversation with something real to offer. That capacity depends entirely on whether you are, somewhere in the private architecture of your days, tending to yourself. Solitude is not the enemy of connection. Solitude is where you recover the self that makes connection possible. And perhaps that is the reframe that matters most here. When you turn inward, you are not choosing yourself over others. You are choosing to become someone worth coming back to. For them, yes, but first and most honestly, for you. So let us stay with that for a moment. The idea that solitude is not a retreat, but a return. Because the word retreat carries a defeat inside it. It suggests you are moving away from something important, conceding ground, losing. But a return is different. A return implies that you belong somewhere before you wandered, that there is a place waiting, that the door is still open. When you go inward, you are not retreating from life. You are returning to the one who has to live it. And yet, even naming it that way, you may feel the resistance rise. Something in you says, "This is self-indulgent. People need things. There is always more to do." Notice that voice. Notice how familiar it is, how early it arrived, how little it ever questions itself. Jung observed that the process he called individuation, the long, unfinished work of becoming genuinely yourself, is resisted not only from the outside but from within. The part of you that learned to survive through usefulness does not trust stillness. It has never been allowed to. Imagine a woman who kept every promise she ever made to other people, and none of the ones she made to herself. Not because she was weak, but because she was precise. She understood, from very early on, that her promises to others had visible consequences. Someone waited, someone was disappointed, someone's face changed, but her promises to herself had no witness. No one saw her set the book down before finishing the first page. No one marked the afternoon she canceled the walk she had needed for 3 weeks. No one counted the accumulated cost of those small, private surrenders. So they were easy to undo, and then easier, and eventually they stopped feeling like surrenders at all. They felt like choices. She told herself she was flexible, accommodating, mature. What she was, very slowly, was disappearing. Not in any way that made headlines, just in the quiet way that a photograph fades when it is left too long in indirect light. The image is still there if you look quickly, but something essential in the contrast has gone. One day, someone who loved her said, "I feel like I am talking to a version of you." She did not know what to say. She thought she had been fully present. She had answered every question. She had listened without distraction. But what the person was sensing was the very thing she had been unable to see. That behind the careful attention, behind the warmth she was genuinely offering, there was no one home in the deeper room. The self that would have pushed back, disagreed, surprised, been surprised. The self that had its own weather. That self had not been tended. And so even her love had become a performance, not because it was false, but because she had nothing left that was only hers. Returning inward is how you refurnish that room. It does not require dramatic withdrawal. It does not mean announcing to the people in your life that you are unavailable, or building a philosophy of distance, or mistaking coldness for depth. What it means is something quieter and more specific, that you begin to honor the promises you make to yourself with the same seriousness you bring to the ones you make to others, that you treat your own attention as a resource with limits, not an obligation without them, that you allow yourself, in small and regular increments, to do nothing that is for anyone else, to think thoughts no one asked you to think, to feel what you actually feel rather than what is convenient to feel, to be somewhere that has no audience. This is what Schopenhauer meant when he wrote that a man can be himself only so long as he is alone. Not that society is the enemy, but that the self is a fragile thing in the presence of others, always tempted toward performance, always one approval away from adjusting itself. Time alone is not wasted time. It is the only time in which the self is not a negotiation. And when you come back from that, and you do come back, That is the whole point. You come back as something more honest, not harder, not more defended, more honest. The connection you offer carries weight because it comes from somewhere real. The people you love feel the difference, even if they cannot name it. Solitude is not where you go to escape others. It is where you go to find the version of yourself that is worth returning to them. And so we arrive at the question that perhaps has been waiting underneath all of this, the one this entire reflection has been quietly building toward. Not how do you change, not what should you do differently, but something quieter and in some ways more difficult to sit with. If you had spent even half the energy on knowing yourself that you have spent on being understood by others, who would you be right now? Take that with you, not as a rebuke, as a genuine, open question, because it does not have a wrong answer. Whatever comes up when you ask it, the ache, the recognition, the small flicker of something that might be hope, that response is already the beginning of an answer. There is a face passing through your mind right now, isn't there? Someone who received your best attention while you were learning to disappear in front of them. The pattern behind that, why you give yourself most fully to the people who make you feel least like yourself, that is something I explored in depth in a separate video. The mechanism is precise, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. It is linked in the pinned first comment below, and it may be the most important thing you watch after this. I want to say something personal before we close. There was a period in my life when I was genuinely convinced that my own inner life was less urgent than everyone else's. Not because anyone told me so directly, though some did in the small, quiet ways people communicate what they need from you, but because I had learned very early that attentiveness to others was rewarded and attentiveness to myself was called something else: selfishness, withdrawal, ingratitude. So I diverted, for years. And I was, by most visible measures, good at it. I was present for people. I was reliable. I was the kind of person who answered the phone. And then one day, I sat in a room alone and realized I did not know what I actually thought about my own life. Not what I hoped others thought of it. Not what I performed when asked. What I actually thought. And the silence where that answer should have been was one of the more unsettling things I have ever encountered. This channel grew out of that silence, out of the slow, unglamorous work of learning to be a fair witness to yourself. Not harsh, not flattering, just honest. Jung called it individuation. I call it the longest conversation I have ever had. It is still going. If you stayed through this entire reflection, I am grateful, genuinely. These are not easy things to sit with, and the fact that you did not look away says something about you that is worth noticing. The video in the pinned comment below goes further into the pattern we touched on midway through, why the people we sacrifice ourselves for are often the ones we unconsciously chose because something in us recognized the familiar weight of being needed. Watch it when you are ready, not before. If something in this reflection moved something in you, leave a like. It costs you nothing, and it tells me that this kind of thinking is worth continuing. And in the comments, I would like you to write just this, or something close to it. I am done shrinking to make room for people who were never going to fill the space anyway. Write it even if it does not feel entirely true yet, especially if it does not feel entirely true yet. Sometimes the sentence has to come before the belief. Subscribe if you want to keep going. This channel will not shout at you, will not promise you transformation in 7 minutes, and will almost certainly not improve your productivity. What it will do, or try to do, is sit with you in the questions that do not have clean answers, and trust that the sitting itself is worth something. That is a strange offer for the internet. It keeps surprising me that anyone takes it. The video appearing on screen now takes everything we touched in this reflection and goes one layer deeper, into the specific moment when the turning inward begins, not as a decision you make, but as something that simply becomes unavoidable. I think you will recognize it.